Sean, welcome to the Soccer Queens podcast. It's nice to have you.
Very nice to be here, and thanks for the kind invitation.
I have been wanting to have you on for a couple years now, I think,
Mhm,
and I've been following your amazing work on growth and maturation and biobanding and just some super fascinating research that you're doing and just all the work that you're putting out on Twitter. I know a lot of
mhm.
soccer parents I work with are eager to hear from you today and love your work as well. So we'll get into all of that soon, but maybe just give a background on your career working in this
Mhm.
space and where you're at today.
Yeah, well, I kind of first got into the area of growth and maturation when I did my PhD at Michigan State University. So I have spent quite a period of time in the United States, first doing my PhD with a Professor Robert Molina, who's considered to be the godfather in this particular field. Then I had 3 years at the University of Washington in Seattle. And my wife is American too, so strong ties to America. And so I kind of got into the area of studying growth and maturation in children in the United States. I'd always been interested in sort of youth athlete populations, and I found the area particularly fascinating. And not just looking at it from a performance perspective, but also looking at the psychology of growth and maturation as well, which is quite fascinating. And when I came back to the University of Bath in the United Kingdom, that's when the work really took off. The Lawn Tennis Association, who are our kind of leading organization for tennis in the United Kingdom, but also the Premier League were particularly interested in this topic and interested in funding some research in this area. And I've been working with them, the British Gymnastics, the Scottish FA, a lot of different organizations on this particular topic, and it's been a real fun experience and a great learning experience for me as well, working with the various clubs and organizations.
Now, there's a lot of parents listening to this podcast who have really young girls playing soccer, tend to get a lot of listeners in that 11 to
Mhm.
14 age range.
Yep.
And why is it important for the parent to also understand growth and maturation for their girl?
There's a number of reasons why you'd want to understand it from both a performance perspective, but also in terms of injury and training, trying to keep the child injury free during that period of the growth spurt. So, from a training and a performance perspective, what we tend to find is that in many sports, particularly those sports that demand maybe greater size or strength or power, we often find it's that the early developing girls who might have that particular advantage around the ages of 11 or 12, they go through the growth spurt a little bit earlier, they may be stronger and a little bit more powerful. And so, in any sports that demand size, such as tennis or strength, there we're going to see the selection bias towards those early maturing girls. And those girls who may mature 5 or 6 years later down the line, they got a little temporary disadvantage at that point of time. So, helping understand why one child may be really thriving at the ages of 11 and another might be struggling, often that might be down to individual differences in growth and maturity. And those differences can be huge. We can find amongst children of the same chronological age, so say amongst a group of 11-year-olds, we might get 5 to 6 years difference in terms of biological age, with some children maybe being, say, 13 or 14 years of age biologically, and others maybe being maybe 8 or 9 years of age biologically. And again, that's just simply down to genetics in terms of whether you mature early or late, and the child themselves has little bearing over it. But it can have pretty big impacts in terms of who gets selected for which certain sports teams, but also how well they perform in those sports teams. Those early developers, they might get a little bit lazy. They might rely too much upon that physicality, not develop the technical and tactical skills, and get caught a little bit short when everybody catches up with them. But for those late developers, they need to be supported and tell them that that growth will come at some point of time, and they really stick in with it at that point. It might be challenging here just now at this point, but with continued effort and work that they should be able to go on and succeed because everybody grows. It's just that we all grow at different times.
Now, I know for the parents listening, they maybe have a late developer. Are
Mhm.
they completely at a disadvantage, or are there some things that they can really work on during this time as other girls are growing faster and
Mhm.
running faster? What can late developers focus on and kind of use to their advantage?
Yeah, well, certainly they need to focus upon things such as technical, tactical abilities and skills because they're never going to win a physical battle. They just don't have those attributes at that point of time. But what we tend to find in many of the academies is that those individuals who are stuck within the academy, who manage to be retained, are generally technically, tactically, or psychologically superior to many of those early developers. It may be down to the bigger challenges that they face, but to some extent, they have to possess those kind of abilities just to survive and compete. And of course, the great thing is that eventually those physical differences will take place when they will sort of be negated when the individual does go through that growth spurt. And often it's the late developer who, in the long term, can actually be the most successful. And we've seen great examples of this through some of the futures programs in Belgium, for example, where they actually had specific national team programs for late developers who, at the age of, say, under 16s, might only be biologically 14 or 13, but, were talented football players. And while they couldn't compete in the under 16s national squad, they knew that eventually, when they grew and developed, they would come through and be successful. So players such as Courtois, De Bruyne, Dries Mertens, all have benefited from those programs. Classic late developers who maybe weren't the best athlete at maybe 12, 13, but eventually they grew and eventually developed, and that's when their true abilities showed up. But it was only about 18 or 19 down the line. So for the late developers, success is there, but it's just going to take you a wee bit more time and perseverance to get to.
I think that gives a lot of parents hope listening because I think
Hmm.
it's easy for them to get caught up in the now and instant gratification, like, why aren't they growing and why are they slower
Yes.
than everyone else? But that's so amazing for them to really
Hmm.
zoom out and look at that bigger long term picture. Now, in terms of injury risk during this
Hmm.
time, what are some things that you are finding in early versus late developers? Is one
Yeah.
group at a higher risk than others, or does it really just depend?
Yeah, when it comes down to maturation, it's not so much whether you're early, on time, or late, which appears to be the problem. The biggest factor is probably your maturity status, which is where you are in the maturity journey. And what we tend to find is that when we go through that growth spurt, for most girls, that's going to be maybe around the ages of, say, 10 or 11 years that will start to take off on that growth spurt. For some late developers, it might be much later, maybe 14 or 15. But when they start to go through that growth spurt, we all of a sudden have rapid growth of the skeleton. And at the certain sites, such as the epiphyseal sites, where the tendons are going to be attached to the bone, or we've looked at the growth plate, because of that rapid growth, the sites there tend to be a little bit more fragile. So if you overload a child at that point of time, that's when we start to get apophyseal injuries, such as severs or Osgood-Schlatters tending to present itself. But also with a more fragile growth plate, there's increased likelihood for fractures if you're overloading a child at that point. And it's fascinating because when we look at the data, and keep in mind, most of this data is coming from boys' academies, what we see is a perfect spike of injuries that mimics the growth spurt in terms of its prevalence. And the way the growth spurt works is interesting. So we don't just all grow at one time in every part of the body. It's the feet that first start to grow, then it's the lower legs that grow, and eventually it's the torso and the pelvis that will be growing. So it takes a little bit of time for that to occur. And so we see a pattern of injury such as the severs presenting at the start of the growth spurt. So that's in the back of the heel. It'll then be the Osgood-Schlatters in the knees, which is the next sort of growth-related injury to occur. And then later on at the back end of the growth spurt is where we get sort of lower back pain, such as PARS, or we might get some pelvic or groin-related issues. Um, the key thing, I guess, is recognizing when a boy or a girl is going through that phase and just being a little bit more aware of some of the symptoms associated with those injuries. Because not every boy or girl will get injured during the phases, but we do see an increase in prevalence of injury. And if you do see that symptomology coming to the fore, well, it's a point of time where you might ease off or you might adapt that training program. So maybe you're moving on to softer surfaces, so more training programs or sessions run on grass. For some of the clubs that we work with, they'll have their what they call a growers club, which is all those boys or girls who are identified in the middle of the growth spurt. They'll actually take some of their sessions off from regular football training. They'll take them into the gym. They'll have nice, soft, padded floors. They'll be doing a lot of work on sort of balance disruptive surfaces, such as crash mats, where they might be doing ball juggling. They'll do a lot of work on core strength, balance, coordination, all the kind of things a child needs at that point of time. And often they're doing those activities in sock feet or in bare feet as well. So it's kind of hard to do high intensity. And what we found from those programs in the Premier League academies is those clubs who are running these types of programs, they're reducing their injuries by about 72% in terms of incidence, and the days lost to injuries have been reduced by about 90%, which is great because we're keeping the kids healthy during those phases. And if you pick up, say, severs, you're more likely to get Osgood-Schlatters. If you get Osgood-Schlatters, you're more likely to pick up the PARS. And so reducing the chances of those injuries keeps the kids healthy at that point of time. And sure, yes, they may step out of maybe one or two training programs, but they're actually still training. They're just training smarter at that point. And I know from some of the wonderful work that you currently do with your young athletes, you really focus upon when they're going through those growth spurts, giving them the strength and the balance and the coordinative type of exercises to allow them to adapt and become efficient and effective movers. And if you can do that, well, you can keep them healthy through that phase. It reduces the chances of future injury, and it also keeps them playing, which is important. In fact, when we ran those programs at Bournemouth Academy, I think even when we took into account the amount of days we'd taken away from the athletes, coaches ended up getting about 125 extra training days with those boys throughout the academy season because they were healthy.
That is so inspiring, and I always admire the youth academies in Europe, and it's a little bit different here, but, I think it is so important that they're getting that variety of movement and working on other motor skills that they're not getting from soccer. What do you recommend for youth parents in the United States who are pretty much playing 12 months a year? There
Mhm.
are coaches here that still continue the season during the summer months too, when they
Yeah.
should really be away from that. What do you
Mhm.
recommend those parents do? Should they stand up to the coach or, I mean, it is hard to navigate, so I'm not sure if you have any advice.
Yeah, it's a tricky one. Any good coach working in youth soccer should have an understanding of growth and development and should have some awareness that when the boys or the girls go through these phases, that there is a need to adapt training programs on some occasions. True, some kids will go through the growth spurt and they'll have no problems, no adolescent awkwardness at all. But it certainly doesn't hurt at that phase of development to introduce these types of programs and be aware at least of the symptomology associated with these injuries. So, as a young boy, I pretty much played every sport that was out there. I got severs, I got Osgood slatters. I really didn't know what was happening at that point of time. But if I had been more aware of it, I could have eased off and still trained, but done smarter training, things that would actually support me and maybe reduce the chance of injury. And we know that there's nothing better than simply things such as strength training, which can be really, really important for young athletes. So, certainly having that conversation with the coach, being aware and monitoring. Certainly, any good academy should be monitoring growth and development in children, just to be aware of when the kids are going through those different types of phases. It's something that the IOC currently recommend. You have to be careful with it, particularly when working with young girls, because there's issues around measuring heights and weights, etc. So it needs to be handled in a sensitive manner, but it needs to be handled in a manner so all those weights and measurements is to understand the child's developmental journey so that we know when the child is going through those phases of development and we're aware, we're listening to the child. And the child's voice is going to be really important in this. If they're showing that they are limping a little bit more when they're coming off the field, they are showing those aches and pains, just being careful in terms of taking that step backwards for a period of time and giving that opportunity for rest and recovery because it is going to be incredibly important for the athlete. And even though you may be taking them away for training for a little bit here and there, you're probably actually saving a lot of training days down the line because they're not getting injured. And if they get injured, as I said, that predicts future injuries, and that can cause a whole host of problems. Not for the child, just at that point of time in adolescence. With some of these injuries, they can develop into tendinopathies down the line. So you're talking about not just a healthy child, but a healthy adult that you want to focus in at this point of time.
That is such an important point that some of these nagging injuries during the growth spurt, they seem minor, but they could
Hmm.
turn into something more catastrophic if they're not properly taken care of or parents aren't aware and everyone's just kind of pushing through the pain, which is not
Yeah.
good either.
Yeah. Something else to highlight too, I would just quickly say as well, is this is good practice. These methods, these principles, these were developed actually at Ajax about 10, 15 years ago when Jan Willem Tunissen was working there. The Ajax are arguably one of the most successful academies we've had. Similarly, if I look at my colleague, Javier Monasterio at Athletic Club Bilbao, they do exactly the same. Again, another incredibly successful academy. Arsenal, Poddy Roche, I know you know Poddy very well, absolutely on the money with regards to the growth and maturation. So this is not something that is just being nice and mollycoddling children. This is something that the best academies are doing. So this is excellent practice. And these ideas, these aren't my ideas. These are ideas that are coming from the people in the field who are developing the top athletes. So definitely something to embrace.
Yeah, that's so true. It's not like this is coddling athletes or making them weaker. It's really just putting them in new challenging environments. And I've seen some, I think it was from the IX Academy that they have a jungle gym and rope
Yep.
climbing and monkey bars for the kids. And my gosh, first of all, that sounds so fun. And it
Yeah.
also builds so much strength and stability and balance and just all these amazing skills for them to be good athletes and healthy. So, the best clubs are doing it, and I
Mhm.
encourage coaches listening or club directors listening to really think about incorporating some of these programs for youth. So, thanks
Yeah.
for bringing that up.
Yeah,
Now,
there
the
is a just to add, there is a book called The Athletic Skills Model, which
I
was
love
written
that
by a
book.
number of the staff members who were at the Ajax Academy at that time. And Jan Willem Tunissen has a chapter specifically on managing the growth spurt, and a lot of wonderful ideas that Jan had are present in that chapter. So definitely worth checking out.
Amazing book. It's always
Hmm.
worth the revisit. I think I've read it like 50 times.
Yeah.
But I think every coach should have it, not just performance coaches or growth and maturation researchers. I think it's important for every team coach to open up the athletic skills model and understand
Hmm.
what's going on. I'll leave the link to the book below so everyone
That would
can
be
check
good.
that out. Now, moving on to biobanding. So,
Hmm.
when this started, I'm not sure the year it started, but it was a big thing and everyone was talking about it. Is it good or bad for kids? So, you are the expert in this. So, I want you to talk about what is biobanding and why are we starting to implement it more at the youth level?
Okay, so biobanding is simply the process of grouping children by attributes relative to growth and maturation rather than age. Now, it's important to keep in mind as well that biobanding is not a replacement for age group competition. Biobanding is something that, for example, the Premier League will use alongside age group competition. So it doesn't replace age groups. Age groups is still the bread and butter of competition. This is another format that can be used, and the Premier League have many different formats. They have out of balance competitions, player led festivals. Biobanding is just one of those additional formats. So, biobanding, in the way that the Premier League use it, is what we do is we actually start to match the kids by their biological ages. So rather than just simply their chronological ages. So we typically use it around the ages of 11 to 15 because that's when we get the biggest differences between the early and the late developers. And what we typically do is we break the children down into sort of biobands. And the biobands that we use are measures a percentage of predicted adult stature. So we usually go with a 5% band. So we'll get all kids who are between 85 to 90% of adult height. Those are kids who are just taking off in the growth spurt. We might have another band which is 90 to 95, and that's kids who are coming on the downside of the growth spurt, starting to bulk up at this point of time. We're starting to see boys who are muscular, who look like young men at that point. And then sometimes we may have 80 to 85, which is boys who haven't gone through the growth spurt yet. And what we do in the bio banding is naturally we do all the assessments in the boys in the academies and we come up with boys who fit in with particular teams within particular biological age groups. And of course, what happens there naturally is that those early developing boys, they're pushed up competing against boys who are physically matched but older and more experienced. They can't rely on their physicality. It's going to be a struggle for them. It's going to be difficult for them. It's also playing a much faster game with smarter players too. So it's a real challenge. They can't just relax anymore. It's going to push them. And of course, their age group games are often not pushing them enough. In contrast, those late developers, they may be playing down. And for that instance, it's going to be a situation where, physicality isn't an issue for them. They're going to be physically matched with the other kids. They're also older, smarter, and wiser. If anything, we expect them to command the game at this point of time. They're no longer the little kid in the game. So we expect them to take on leadership positions in that instance. And the overall idea with biobanding is that in an age group, we can get these big David versus Goliath situations where we get one big kid, pump the ball up to the front, he pushes over to all the other kids and scores. It's not really a good quality football game. All of a sudden, nobody's got this advantage in a biobanded game. And what's fascinating in the bio-banded games, we see a lot more emphasis upon technical, tactical play. We see a lot more passing, particularly passing within the defensive half as well. And when we sat down with the early and late developers, what we find is benefits, but for completely different reasons. When we first did these tournaments with the Premier League, we sat down and both the early and maturing and late maturing boys both loved the concept but for completely different reasons. The early maturing boys were coming back going, "Crikey, that was tough. That was really, really difficult. I couldn't rely on my physicality." They were really being quite honest about it. They talked about it being a faster game, having to receive the ball more quickly, to release the ball more quickly. With Southampton's academy, we found the early maturing boys scanning more as well, so they're looking around a lot more because it is a faster game. They don't have to do that in their age group, and if they're not challenged in their age group, they're not going to develop those types of abilities. And what the early maturers loved as well is they were playing with older boys who took them under the wing, who taught them, who mentored them. So it was a great learning experience for them. And also, it was a chance to fail. And these boys are not failing enough in their own age groups. They need to be able to figure out how to fail, how to deal with adversity, because in age group games, they're typically not having that. And eventually, if they go up to under 18s, under 23s, they're going to be playing against full grown men. They will be the weakest individual. So they need to learn that at that process. And they saw it as a really positive experience. Now, the late developers, they went down and they said, yeah, physically this was a little bit easier for them, but it gave them the opportunity to actually use their physicality, hold a player off for once. In addition, they were able to take on sort of a more commanding role of the game, take on those leadership positions, which was quite a surprise for the coaches because they would say, well, this little boy would never say boo to a goose in a football game. And all of a sudden, he's telling everybody what to do, he's mentoring, he's teaching. And of course, we know that one of the best ways of actually learning and consolidating one's learning is through teaching. And these boys really stepped up to the plate. Now, that's what we did with the Premier League. We then went over to US soccer and we rolled it out with US soccer. But of course, US soccer did it with boys and with girls. Now, this was fascinating because with the girls, we really weren't sure whether an early maturity would be as big of an advantage because although they might be a bit taller and a little bit stronger, because those early maturing girls might be putting on a little bit more fat mass, it might be a slight disadvantage. But what we found out very quickly is those early maturing girls in soccer, they're not fat at all. They're actually very strong. They're very physical. So we found exactly the same sort of effect for those early maturing girls when they were playing up. They really relished this challenge. And the late maturing girls really stepped into those leadership positions. In fact, I think the late maturing girls really got it better than the late maturing boys. I think they were a little bit more socially switched on at that point of time, and they really stepped into those leadership positions. And when they came back and they says, "Yeah, we love this, but it shouldn't replace age group games. It should be part of a more broader sort of addition or diversity in the games program." And this is the key thing because if you just give them age group competition, kids fall into certain ways of playing, etc. They don't stretch themselves, or they're always struggling and they give up. If you can provide a diversity of game formats, it's a much, much better learning experience for the kids. And I think this is where the Premier League have really done a great job. And what I think also helped for us as well is that the whole biobanding principle and biobanding concept that was driven by the club. It wasn't us or the Premier League who came up with the ideas. It was the Southamptons, the Norwiches, the Readings, the West Hams, all those other clubs who came to the fore and said, "Look, we'd like to try this." And since then, pretty much most clubs in England have done biobanding at other phases. In fact, we got some biobanding tournaments coming up in England just in October coming up, and we've got a good buy-in from all the clubs as well. So it's something that's here to stay. I'd also argue it's really beneficial for the coaches because it gives the coach a chance to see a player in a different situation. And that early maturing boy who may have been bossing the game, absolutely dominating, all of a sudden you go, actually, he's not that good at this, and this is an area he needs to work on his game. Or that late developer, you suddenly see new things in them that you might not have seen before. And it greatly influences some of the coach evaluations too. So when we did some projects at Southampton's FC, we found that when we look at those early developers and we look at the match grades, often if the early developers are just in the age groups, they get fantastic match grades. The late developers get really bad match grades. And of course, when it comes to scholarship decisions at the end, those match grades are important. If you're just looking up in their age group, you're going to give all the contracts to the early developers. All the late developers get cut. But with the bio banding, we now see them in different environments. So Southampton will have the match grades for age group games, but also the match grades for bio banded games. So if kid's good in his age group, he's good in his bio band, yeah, definitely contract. It's not simply maturity he's benefiting from. But if he's maybe struggling a little bit more in his bio banding, but okay in his age group, maybe we think a little bit more about it. So there's a greater degree of developmental sensitivity taken into account now because we've seen kids in slightly different formats and we can see kids' true abilities come to the fore. And it's been great to have it now with the girls' programs as well, but US taking the lead in that one.
Well, that's my next question. coaches of girls who are listening or even parents, how can they start to implement this in the US soccer
Mhm,
clubs? You mentioned there's specific games for biobanding. How many times
mhm.
a year do they do that, or do you think is best?
Yeah. So the way it worked in the Premier League is mostly we have certain clubs who are into the bio banding, like the bio banding, and they will organize competitions or tournaments with other clubs just simply by contacting them and saying, look, Arsenal may say, okay, we've got this particular week which is free. Southampton, would you like to come and have a tournament with us? And they'll organize it themselves. There is, however, more and more of a call from the academies now for the Premier League games program to actually embed more of these diverse fixtures, whether it be the player led festivals or the bio banding as a direct sort of official part of their fixture program. And I think that will be coming in the next couple of years. But currently, just now, it's a case of clubs who have an interest in the concept, who want to challenge their kids in a slightly different way, talking to other clubs and saying, hey, would you like to have a bio banded festival? Setting up the measurements, agreeing on a policy and practice, and then coming together and doing those types of tournaments. And we see the bio banding as well at the national level with these future teams at Belgium and Sweden, Denmark, the Netherlands. I now have their own futures team. Those nations are coming together and saying, look, we want a specific tournament for late developing players who we think might not be successful at 16 or 17, but come 19 or 20, when they're fully developed, these could be some of our best players. And again, that's largely, well, to some extent, UEFA have done a really good job of supporting those projects, but that's a case of the clubs reaching out or the nations reaching out and contacting one another. So go out and find like-minded organizations who are interested in trying this out and seeing the benefit. And if it works for you, great. If it doesn't, that's fine. You stick with what you're used to.
Now, I have a question about the psychosocial aspect of all of this.
Mhm.
So, for girls especially, how does the growth spurt affect them psychosocially, and what are some ways to navigate that?
Yeah, good question. So yeah, we often talk about the physical aspects of growth and maturation, but often overlook the psych side of things. Most of this work actually comes from developmental psychology, and what we find is that whether you're early on time or late can have an impact in terms of sort of perceptions of competence, but also engagement in sports and physical activity. And what we tend to find in the girls is that actually those girls who mature earlier are the ones who actually perceive themselves as being less sporty, less physically competent in terms of fitness, but also they perceive themselves as less attractive. And it's not really surprising that we tend to find that those early maturing girls are often opting out of sport relatively early on, which is a real problem because, sport is probably the most organized, structured form of physical activity for many kids. And if they're not engaged in sport, then they're maybe not receiving all the benefits of being regularly involved in physical activity from both a physical and a psychological perspective. In contrast, those late developers tend to have more positive perceptions of the self, and this is why we see those late developers continuing in sport for a little bit of a longer period of time. But what's fascinating is that not every early maturing girl would perceive themselves in a negative way, and this is really important because it shows you that the environment that surrounds the girl, the coach, the parents, the peer group are really important in terms of helping validate those feelings. What we find is that early maturing girls who grow up in an environment where they're loved and supported, where they have a high supportive peer group who don't see those changes that occur during puberty as a negative thing or as a barrier towards physical activity. Those girls stay as active and are unlikely to drop out of sports. It's those ones who interpret them in a negative way who are more likely to drop out of sports. I remember sitting having a conversation one day with a girl who was of an African Caribbean background, and I was explaining to her that her research had showed that early maturing girls perceive themselves more negatively and are more likely to drop out of sport. And she goes, yeah, I fully understand that, but that's very much a Western perspective on things. In an African Caribbean culture, going through puberty, becoming a woman is seen as a really attractive consequence of growing up. It's not perceived in a negative way at all. Those girls feel good, they feel attractive, they don't perceive those changes as a barrier towards physical activity at all. So it was complete opposite for her experience growing up in that culture. But very much our kind of Caucasian, British, Western cultures, for example, that change in terms of putting on fat mass, putting on curves, etc., is often interpreted negatively. And again, we got to keep in mind those early maturing girls are the first ones within their age group cohort to go through that process. They will also typically have a slightly more intense pubertal growth spurt as well. So maybe putting on a little bit more fat mass. And so it's understanding why they might struggle to adjust to those types of changes, but it really highlights the importance of the coach and the mum and the dad and the family and the peer group in terms of supporting and saying, look, this is great. These changes are natural processes that everybody goes through and should not be perceived in any negative way. In fact, they should be celebrated, and they should certainly not be a barrier towards engagement in physical activity. So really important to consider those.
The words matter with what the parents are saying to their daughters, and I've heard some parents of early developing girls talk about their weight a lot
Yep.
in a negative way and mention,
Hmm.
"Oh, well, she feels awkward when she runs because she has extra weight on her," or "She just isn't moving the way she used to," and it's
Hmm.
comments like that that don't help. And
Yes.
I'm really glad you touched on how we have to keep it positive and normalize it too.
Yeah.
That's really
Yeah.
key.
Yeah, you have to be aware that these changes are natural. And yes, putting on fat mass is potentially going to be challenging, maybe a potential injury risk as well. If you're, say, coming down with greater forces when you're accelerating, decelerating, for example, then there may be increased risk for knee related injuries. But recognizing that and putting things in place to help address that, this is why strength training is so important. You know, girls will all naturally put on fat mass when they go through puberty. And it's no surprise that we get this 4 to 5 fold increase in terms of ACL, MCL injuries when girls go through puberty because they're putting on this extra mass, the same amount of mass that a boy will be doing, but they're not putting on that same level of strength that the boys will be going as they go through those phases. And this is why it's so important to encourage girls to continue with strength training during that period of time because naturally, yes, they will increase in terms of mass. Yes, they will increase in terms of fat mass. But if we can also increase in terms of strength at that point of time, then we know that that's going to be super important in terms of protecting their health at that point of time. And there's some fantastic work that Tim Hewitt has done, and some of the guys who were previously at a university in Cincinnati, the medical hospital for youth there. Greg Meyer, I think, is the chap up there who's been done some fantastic work looking at strength training and the importance of it in terms of reducing injury. So, yes, being aware of those changes, yes, those are natural changes, but supporting girls as effectively, both physically and psychologically during that point of time is going to be really, really important.
Absolutely. I like to call it turning growing pains into gains.
Yes, I think that's a good thing. That's a
Yeah.
great way of framing it.
Yeah, it's more empowering to frame it that way for girls, and that strength training
Mhm,
is really key. I've had, Dr. Tim Hewitt on the podcast before, and I think he
mhm.
said girls who strength train, they can reduce ACL by 50% or more.
Yep.
It's an amazing number and very, very
Yeah,
hopeful. So,
yeah.
anyone listening, strength training is key year round and consistently.
Yeah, and I think the key thing we would add to his work is that you need to consider the timing of that strength training as well, because some girls will go through the growth spurt early. It might be 9 or 10 that they're going through it. For other girls, it might be 14 or 15 that they go through the growth spurt. So knowing when the girls are facing those challenges and making sure that the training is incorporated and integrated to their practice at that point of time is going to be incredibly important.
And you would say that some girls would be able to load faster than other girls because of that maturity level?
I think it's more so a case of them needing to load,
Mhm.
certainly, because if you are going through those types of changes, then certainly increasing, and it may just be body weight type exercises to begin with, but trying to increase strength at the same time that weight is going up is going to be important. For a later developing girl, she's probably maybe going to be 14 or 15 when she goes through that growth spurt. And so, you know, prior to that, there really wouldn't be that additional extra risk because she's not putting on that weight at that point of time. So it's just being aware of when that risk is increasing. For one girl, it might be early, another girl, it might be slightly later on. Naturally, when girls go through puberty, there will be slight increases in testosterone, so they will be able to improve not just in terms of a neuromuscular adaptation, but also in terms of structural adaptation. And again, that would occur earlier for the early maturing girl than it would do for the late maturing girl. But certainly, all girls at the ages of, I would say, through 10, 11 or so should at least be engaging in some form of training, even if it's just neuromuscular adaptation you're focusing upon. Quality of movement, but also improving strength through neuromuscular adaptation would be important. So, yeah, all the work by Tim, John, and Rodri at Cardiff Met, doing all their wonderful work with the youth physical development model, etc., all incredibly valuable for girls as they go through that growth spurt. In fact, I'd argue strength training for girls is much more important for girls than it is for boys as they go through the growth spurt because of that additional risk.
Mhm. And I think when people hear the phrase strength training, they think it is just weights, dumbbells, and
Yeah.
barbells, but a game of tug of war could be strength
Yeah.
training, or going
Oh,
across monkey bars, or climbing a
yep.
rope. So, and for the young ones, 10, 11s, 12s, those movements are so valuable.
Mhm. Yeah, incredible. It doesn't need to be getting a kid into a gym and pumping weights and iron, etc. There's a lot of classic kind of body movement, sort of body weight exercises that can be used and can be introduced as fun drills as well. Like as I said, with athletic skills model, they were incredibly creative, and the kids enjoyed those activities so much at Ajax. They were turning up 20 minutes early for training sessions because they enjoyed things so much. So if you're creative and it can be really good fun. It can be excellent fun.
Well, Sean, this has been fantastic. Just so much to learn. And I'm sure a lot of the parents and coaches have been taking notes or might revisit this episode. But where can people find you for more?
Yeah, so I am on Twitter. I think it's PhD_Sean. I think Twitter gave me that name rather than me me giving it. It just automatically popped up. And I regularly post content relative to growth and maturation there in sports, but also in other areas such as exercise and health, where it's equally important to consider. I'm also at the University of Bath. If anybody has any questions about the work that we're doing, certainly don't hesitate to get in contact. I'm sure you can put my email address associated with the podcast down in the description below. So, yeah, if anybody wants to get in touch, certainly don't hesitate. Always happy to help.
Brilliant. I'll include all those links in the caption below. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and I will see you guys next time.